I want to say I was inspired by Carrie Livingston in the last hour reading from indigenous writings, and it reminds me to acknowledge and appreciate that we here in Marin are living in coastal Miwok territory. The coastal Miwok, of course, did not use electricity. Maybe long after we came, they adopted it, but clearly the culture evolved and lived sustainably without it. You know, we have a long history of electricity in our culture. Coal first brought us that electricity. Then oil came and gave us greater mobility. Natural gas brought us clean heat. And then nuclear came along and it brought us longevity. Now the question is, do renewables allow us invincibility? I think it's a tough question, but we'd like to hear from you, the caller, and I'd like my guests to chime in as well.
Bernie, this is Lyons. You didn't mention water wheels. They were creating power, at least. I don't know if it was literally electricity, but if you think about the mills in New England and the South.
Excellent point. And mostly that was turned into mechanical power so that they could then run a lathe or they could run a crusher for their corn and stuff. And the windmills that preceded electricity, like in Holland, as we all still see them, those were driving pumps often to pump water, you know, and the farms throughout the western United States were mostly mechanical windmills where they were pumping up the water rather than first converting it to electricity and then electricity doing that. So,
well, and clearly the mechanical version could only make a small area function. By creating electricity in the grid, then you can send that power to a wider range.
Well, absolutely. The ability for us to connect all of these power generations through the grid have made our lives incredibly powerful, easy. Raven, you talked about that technology on a previous show, how we have now had a huge upsurge in technology. Do you think we could go back and live in a mode pre-electricity? Without electricity?
Well, you know, it wasn't that long ago that we lived without electricity, 1 or 2 generations ago. I used to live in a small village in rural West Cornwall called Zenner, and they didn't have electricity there at all until 1970s. And I used to go around and ask the elders, what was it like, before there was electricity here? How did you survive? How did you farm? How did you get around? How did you feed your children? And how did you cook and heat your homes? And so this knowledge it's still intact in some of the older members of our community. I do think it's possible to go back to that way of life. I don't know. I think it's likely that we will end up there as well.
It certainly would slow us down. We couldn't move so fast, do so many things in a day, so on and so forth, contact so many other people.
Wow, wouldn't that be great?
I don't hear any of the politicians today talking about slowing down. What they're all unanimous in is that we must grow our economy. And growing our economy means using more power, using more electricity, using more fossil fuels.
So sorry, Bernie. Go ahead.
It's okay. I mean, worldwide, we have been on the increase. Since 1985, global electricity production has grown on an average of 450 terawatt hours per year. Don't ask me what a terawatt is. It's huge. But this amount of huge increase, the International Energy Agency expects that will continue, and they project out to the year 2035. So there's no insight of trying to get the world to use less electricity.
Well, consumption is really what's at the bottom of this, isn't it?
Well, yes, and it drives all our industry. I mean, we have an industrial civilization that is based on this cheap energy coming from coal, then oil, then gas, and continued fracking. And the reason we continue fracking, even though most people don't wish it, and most people don't wish us to start drilling in the Arctic, but the countries are competing to get there first, is that they all set this idea of we must grow our economy as more important than we must save our planet and save our...
I have not lived without electricity for more than a week, let's say. Has either of you lived without electricity?
Well, the happiest time of my life was when I lived off-grid in a one-room adobe house somewhere it was out between Santa Fe and Taos in New Mexico, in the middle of nowhere. And, my driveway was 21 miles of rutted four-wheel drive road, and I was completely at peace there. I didn't have any PV panels or any electricity. I had to pack in my own water, pack out my own waste. The toilet was literally a hole in the ground. And, I rose with the sun, and I went to sleep when it got dark. And, really developed during that time an acute appreciation for the bare necessities of life, the simple things: water, food, shelter, and warmth. And I was, I had complete peace of mind. I felt so calm and connected, and to my place and to myself, that I haven't felt that way since. I only lived that way for about 2 years, and now I live with smart meters and wireless routers and there's so many gadgets in my house. The power went off the other night and everything went quiet in Inverness. It was like you could
Inverness Park as well.
Yeah, you could almost taste the silence, and that's how much noise and electric. I don't even know what kind of stuff is around us electrically, the radiation or whatever. Anyway, so I did live like that, and it was great.
In 1977, I was in Australia with my brother Charles. We were visiting relatives who live in Queensland, and they took us further north and out into the bush, as they call it, out into the country, to visit friends of the family who ran a sheep station. And then, 1977, there was no power from the nearest town, which was 30 miles down a dirt road, flat, happily for them, I guess. And so they had a generator to create electricity when they needed it. And they didn't have it running all the time. And I learned later, I think it was the late 80s, probably by 1990, that electrical lines were run down that 30-mile road, and they don't need to use the generators anymore.
Well, while the two of you had these great experiences, let me share that a few years back we had storms that took out the PG&E, and 2 days we roughed it, my wife and I, and day 3 we checked into a hotel in Rohnert Park because we were just beside ourselves. We couldn't take it. I mean, I've gone camping and I've on purpose gotten away from it, but when it's yanked away from you like that,
at home,
it really, for me, caused pain, and I think for our society it would cause incredible pain. The pain without electricity of our industrial system, it would grind to a halt. Would it not? I mean, everything runs on either, internal combustion engines with the liquid fuels, or it runs on electricity, or it runs on heat that either gets piped in or trucked in like we do here in our propane tanks. And those 3 major ways that we use power have defined how we live. And we live pretty good that way. And it's so... For me, it's rational that people want to hold on to this way of life that is power-consuming with cheap energy, and then they want to believe that technology will indeed allow us to continue living like that because we keep getting more ingenious as science, and so what we've seen as evolution in technology, like with Moore's law, the doubling the power and shrinking the size by half every year, yes, is a technological phenomenon, and they want that to be an energy phenomenon as well. So we hear about algae as the next fuel. We hear about other kinds of nuclear fusion. These are all hopes. And then, of course, we have wind and solar. And wind and solar are very attractive ideas because the fuel itself we consider free. The photons from the sun, that's free. The wind blowing is free. The problem is that's free, but harnessing it and turning it into electricity, that's not free.
So everything has a cost.
Everything has a cost. And there's no question that, there is a question, but mostly when you compare the typical renewables of a wind turbine or of a solar cell system, total life cycle costs is what we really need to look at. And when you do that, it's close to gas. It's better than oil. It's better than than coal in terms of like CO2 and toxics, et cetera. But in some ways, there are some toxics that we're not tracking that well. And there's certainly a lot of fossil fuel production to get those turbines in place, to get those solar cells in place. And we can't ignore that. So cleaner does not mean clean.
Right. And I've hesitated over buying a hybrid car because of the batteries. There are some pretty intensive, whether they're toxic or rare, materials used to make batteries, and recycling them is a complex problem, I understand. Yeah, there's no straightforward, this is the answer, it seems like.
Well, yeah, and the way we want to have these renewables is not, as we were talking about earlier, like say you're living off-grid in some remote location and you're generating your own wind electricity and you've got some solar PV and you've got good solar design. You're living at a pretty small footprint, and but what you're doing is you're adjusting. You don't buy a big refrigerator. You don't have a big TV. You've got to decide when you're going to run your computer, and if wind hasn't blown for 3 days, you might not be on the internet for 3 days. So you adjust your consumption to the amount of supply that is sort of nature's dose. And we've been used to not living to nature's daily dose, but what over hundreds of millions of years was really captured solar energy in living organisms that then were under pressure and turned into coal, oil, and gas. And so the notion that this handy invention of use of those minerals that we found in our planet and have extracted and have built this whole civilization around, that somehow that can be duplicated through technology, that's wishful thinking. And I think I understand the wishful thinking, but I'd like to hear callers. So we haven't gotten a single caller yet.
Well, before doing this show, I looked up green energy on the internet to see if there was a simple definition, of which there's not. There seems to be quite a lot of confusion, and nuclear is sometimes promoted as green energy. But when I thought, well, then I looked up renewable sources of energy. So that is wind, sunlight, geothermal, algae, plants, right? Water, I guess. Those are the big renewables in the sense that they're always there and we can always tap into them. But then, as you said earlier, Bernie, in order to harness those so-called green energy renewables, we need green technologies. And those are things like solar panels, wind turbines, the hydropower plants, dams. And so I came to this conclusion that, okay, so green energy is synonymous with green technology because you have to have green technology to harness green energy. And then I looked up that on the Oxford Dictionary, and it said, quote, green technology is technology whose use is intended to mitigate or reverse the effects of human activity on the environment. With that definition, I don't believe there's a single clean green energy solution out there that achieves that.
Well, let's talk about a couple that you mentioned. You mentioned plants are renewable, and of course, earlier civilizations have cut down too many trees and cut down their forests and their food supply and have gone extinct. We know the Mayans, we know that Romans probably did that, and other civilizations have a history of sort of outstripping the environment. And the tree was the fuel. Recently in this country, ethanol was promoted as the solution.
Corn-based,
We
right?
already have all this great agriculture going, all this monoculture that is creating all of these billions of bushels of corn. And then over time, we recognize, well, that, of course, when you grow your fuel, you're not growing food. So that was a constraint. But in addition, that way of growing food and that way of growing corn is actually taking things from the soil and then replacing them, the nutrients that were there and the live soil that was there. And then over time, when that becomes sort of inert, is adding in fossil fuel fertilizer, using fossil fuel-based pesticides, using fossil fuel-driven machinery to harvest it. And when they looked at the net impact of ethanol, it's really no better than just continuing to use the petrochemicals that has been the compound. And so now it's a political issue. They talk about it in Iowa being one of the primary states. Corn is a big deal. It's a political issue to keep subsidizing the corn. We subsidize our government almost all forms of power because this power is so essential to running the system, running the economy. And if cheap power goes away, there's a fear that the whole thing will collapse.
Well, and we like cheap food, too. We're used to cheap prices for fuel, cheap prices for food. And it seems to me that the locavore, eat locally movement could perhaps inform our thinking and decisions about where we get our sources of power as we need them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And if we don't feel the need to fly across continents, if we don't feel the need to drive across the country, if we don't feel the need to cross the hill at 55 miles an hour, then we wouldn't need all of this power that we have right now. But somehow we've gotten used to that idea that we have this mobility that is just so incredible that we will continue to want to exercise that amount of mobility, just like we like to exercise having the foods flown in from exotic places. And
I'm not giving up coffee.
There you go. I'm not giving up chocolate.
Well, what are each of us doing to reduce our own personal consumption? I started carrying my own bags. Now we have cloth bags. That's become a big deal. I've been carrying bags in my car for shopping since the mid-1980s. And I don't know that my doing that makes a huge difference, but it means that I'm paying attention to what I'm doing, that I'm not going in and asking for a fresh paper bag or a fresh plastic bag every time I go shopping.
Well, I'll say back in the late 70s, early 80s, I can't remember which, we were living in San Geronimo, and our fuel bills were high, our home leaked, it wasn't really good, and I was seduced by solar. And so I signed up, my wife and I signed up for a large system that was solar panels, which the water got heated and then was stored in a tank and then was sent through the homes in radiators. So in winter, we were going to heat our home. In summer, we were going to heat our pool. We had this monstrosity of a system that was like 3 panels high, and these were 8 by 4 or 5 foot panels. They were huge, huge tank. And then things started going wrong. The system wouldn't work. Panels would explode from air getting trapped in the system. And so it was too early in the cycle. Nowadays, hot water systems are really not like PV systems. They're quite efficient. They don't require as much energy in their production, their maintenance and stuff. So people that put up the hot water systems are indeed, I think, taking a big step forward rather than using fossil fuels or electricity to get hot water. But I continued to be a supporter of renewables. So
yes.
When the Marin Clean Energy program first came forward, I got really involved in that. So I lobbied at the county, in the city of San Rafael, in the city of Novato. I walked door to door. I really helped, and on our show with Post Carbon here on KWMR, promoted Marin Clean Energy. Now I look back and think it hardly makes a difference because, yes, it puts the control of the power that we purchase more in the hands of a local agency rather than this regional power company, this PG&E, that we don't fully trust to be in our best interests. But
well, maybe you don't fully trust.
Well, that many people didn't, et cetera. So
yeah.
I don't see that as having changed that much. But anyway, over time, I've learned from Peter Asmus, and he's a programmer on the station. And Peter, I hope you have time to call in. I remember saying that you might. I've learned some things that really the most important thing is what Peter calls a negawatt. It's the watts you don't use. I'm still using way too much, so I'm not an example of how to live sustainably. But I think I'm fairly typical of what the average person in Marin is, wanting to find a way to lessen our footprint and be feeling like we're making a difference. But I believe that a lot of that is just not enough, soon enough to really make a difference. The way I would say to really make a difference is go live off the grid.
Well, given the population size, though, I don't know that that's a very practical solution.
It surely isn't.
This is Let's Talk Radio with co-hosts Bernie Stephan, Lyons Filmer and Raven Gray. Please call in on 415-663-8492 and share a story with us all, your views on green energy.
Let's talk a minute about nuclear. Nuclear has a lot of fans. Jim Hansen from NASA, who's been a leading climate spokesperson, has said that's where we need to put our focus because it doesn't generate once it's built. Now, there's a difference between constructing that nuclear facility, but once it's built, it doesn't generate the CO2 like all the alternatives do. But, of course, there's this huge liability. There's this huge problem. Imagine if we now decommissioned all nuclear plants. We have that problem we saw in spades in Fukushima. And the idea that if you don't take care of this partially processed or fully processed nuclear material, if you don't cool it, and the way it's cooled is like with diesel generators running cold water over it. And so it requires power after you decommission the plant. And we know how horrible it would be not to keep it cool. But that power calculation is usually not done. Like, what do we do when we decommission a nuclear plant? And, of course, we all know that the waste, there's no good system for keeping it safe. There are these big projects for digging holes in Nevada or Utah or whatever in caves and salt mines. But all of that will take fossil fuel energy. So if we ran out of fossil fuel energy to be all nuclear, wouldn't work either, because we would be sort of creating this problem that then we couldn't contain once we ran out of fossil fuels. And, of course, we're not going to run out of fossil fuels instantly, but we know how we've gone to extreme measures to keep getting it.
Hi, thank you.
You?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Hi, this is Pamela Fish calling from San Rafael, and I was just listening to, I dialed in late, so I apologize if you've already covered this, but I was listening to Bernie speak about nuclear energy. And I think what really needs to happen for real renewable energy to occur is renewable thought about
renewable what?
Are we using energy? There is the paradigm that he was discussing. People think nuclear is a great option. I'm not even going to get into it. I'm an advocate on the issue, the pros and cons of the weapons.
Can you hear us? Your phone line is a little noisy. Are you on a cell phone?
I am. I'm sorry. I don't have anything in my background.
Yeah.
Maybe it's an interference.
Do you have the radio up?
No, I don't have a radio on.
Okay.
Well, hi, Tamala. This is Bernie. I thank you so much for calling. And it has been a little hard hearing you, but I think you were asking something about nuclear energy. Could you tell us that again?
Yes. I'm sorry. Can you hear me maybe better now?
It's better.
Okay, great. I'm just trying to speak right next to my phone here.
Good.
Yes, I think the issue of nuclear energy clearly points out the philosophy problem.
Philosophy, yes.
We can't keep producing and consuming energy to live faster, bigger, stronger. We must backtrack what we're using it for and how much before we can figure out how to source it.
Boy, you're so right, Tamala. We've been talking indeed around that idea that our consumption is the bigger problem, not necessarily where our power is coming from. There are really no clean, neutral forms of energy at the industrial scale, which is the scale we're living at. We're living at this scale where cheap oil, cheap energy has allowed us all of this surplus energy, but that won't be around forever.
And when we think of energy now, we think of something that we use and have waste of at the end, and that's a normal process. It's not.
Waste at the end makes me think of a conversation I had with a Marin fire chief talking about the Valley Fire. Part of what happens is when a fire or some other disaster occurs, afterwards there's a huge amount of cleanup to do. And that's a big part of the cost of any action, whether it's building a new nuclear plant or the result of a wildland fire.
that's that idea of whole systems thinking, where you can't just take the operation of something like an electric car and talk about how that's not using anything but a little bit of electricity versus a lot of gasoline while I'm operating it. Whole systems thinking takes it back to all the input sources, both the manufacture, the mining of the materials, the components, and then at the end, what do you do when you are done and you've reached the end of that life of that car or that thing. So, Tamla, thanks so much for calling, getting us off to a good start here. Appreciate it.
I'm sorry about the microphone. I do have one more point on that.
Okay, let's hear it.
But in the area, of life, energy is to take an inanimate object and make it animate, or to change a state of something, much like life. If something lives and dies in nature, following biomimicry, it breaks down and composts into soil, smaller parts, and thus becomes part of a new energy cycle without an inanimate waste.
Yes, that living cycle, that living and dying, that indeed is a sustainable process. And permaculture is a great example of trying to make sure that you stay within that natural flow of energy, as you say, that dies, goes in the ground, and becomes the nutrient for some new life and sort of keeps that cycle going. What we've done with fossil fuels and it's taken life from hundreds of millions of years and used it up in a couple of generations. Thanks again, Tamla.
Hello, caller. You're on the air.
Well, I would say that, there is no perfect power source, although I would say, it's sort of a cliche in some ways, but the cleanest power source is the power that you don't use. So I would say
negawatts.
One. Yes.
You taught me that term.
Yes, that's true. But I actually didn't invent the term. It was it was Amory Lovins, I believe, and then there was a professor called Arthur Rosenfeld who actually wrote the foreword to my last book, Introduction to Energy in California, who told a story that I think in the 70s at one weekend he decided to figure out how much energy could be saved if we just switched off lights, and discovered in the university that half of the lights had never been switched off, that the switches were hidden behind book racks, and, it was this whole idea of if you calculated the savings. And so, so one is energy efficiency. That should always be your number one target, so it doesn't make sense if you have a 5,000 square foot home to then, add a huge solar panel to that house if it's totally inefficient, because you are basically still overbuilding supply. The main problem with today's grid is that we have to have almost double what we need for power supply just because the system was designed in sort of an old way of thinking, which was revolving around these large centralized power plants like coal plants, nuclear plants, and all this stuff. So my vision of the future is that we have a lot more distributed energy resources, whether that's a solar PV panel, whether it's a small wind turbine, whether it's a battery, whether it's your electric vehicle that can serve as a battery to store your renewable energy when it's plugged into the garage, whether it's things like smart thermostats and things that can shift when you use energy. So, the other trend is something called demand response, which is very big in this country, mainly because we have so much waste in this country. So one creative way to have an impact on the environment, as opposed to using the fossil fuels when the wind dies down, instead of using a fossil fuel plant to sort of provide that power, you can ramp down the demand with new technologies to sort of get to the same effect. And that's called demand response. So, in the future, the vision is your washer and dryer will not operate during certain times of day when there's a power shortage or the price is too high. So it's this vision of sort of smart appliances. Now, I think that in some ways you don't want to make the system too complex because, there can be shortcomings to that and there's other issues associated with that. But, to your overall question, I would say the renewables are always better than fossil, like coal plants, nuclear plants, there is a lot of issues about, how are those technologies manufactured, and even with solar panels, there are some solar panels that use toxic materials, and so there is still an environmental impact.
And they have a limited life. I mean, what do you estimate is the average lifespan of a solar system on your roof, and also of a wind turbine?
Well, I think most people assume 20 years, but I would say the challenge is more a small wind turbine needs a lot of TLC, tender loving care, and most people, aren't interested in that. There are farmers, and I know we've talked with Mark Pasternak on my show, who has a wind turbine that actually has been sitting idle for quite some time just because of some technical issues. So, I wrote a whole book on wind power, so I'm an advocate of wind power. But, generally speaking, those technologies are expected to last 20 years or even 30 years. Now, they may need some upgrades. Certain components may wear out. That's more an issue with a wind turbine, because you think about it, you're putting mechanical devices in the harshest possible environments, because that's where the wind is. And, the higher you go, the better the wind. So in some ways, you're kind of you could say you're asking for trouble, but there's been a lot of advances with wind turbines in particular, and, large-scale, small-scale wind turbines. But I will say, just generally speaking, I think distributed energy is the wave of the future, but I do think we're still going to need large-scale renewables as well, because to make an impact on climate change, it's kind of all of the above, but not like the Obama version of all the above, which would include nuclear and clean coal. It's more all of the above on sort of renewables, energy efficiency, because nothing goes according to plan. You have a lot of not-in-my-backyard issues, which sometimes are legitimate, sometimes not. So you really have to hedge your bets. So the bottom line is, diversity is the key. You don't want to go all solar. You don't want to go all wind. You want a mixture of wind, solar, biomass like cow manure, like the Strauss dairy relies on. There's also tidal power, wave power. There's all kinds of options. So I always say, just like you want a diverse workforce, you want a diverse investment portfolio, you want a diverse portfolio of resources to hedge your bets and hedge risk.
And one of the things you talked about in distributed, I remember when talking to you in the past, if the grid, the grid that covers like many states or the whole United States went down, having islands, having microgrids, something that isn't necessarily 24/7, but still allows for vital needs for power to be met at a local level. Is that not something we should be thinking about in lieu of just assuming that the grid will be there 24/7 and will always meet our demand?
Yeah, well, I could talk about microgrids for literally hours, but yes, I'm sort of emerged by accident as a global expert on microgrids, and it is the wave of the future. So,
excuse me, is that an oxymoron? Global expert on microgrids?
Well, microgrids are very big in India. I mean, in places, the developing world, where they can actually not make the mistakes we did with large centralized coal and nuclear plants, because, first of all, people don't want to invest in those large systems when the customer doesn't have a lot of money to pay. So in those cases, they're actually forced to create things like microgrids and something I call a nanogrid, which is even smaller, and, basically kind of put together, sort of think about how they jumped to cell phones. It's the same analogy. They're skipping the landlines. They're just jumping to these smaller sort of systems. So, the other thing is, if we get all this distributed energy out there, the current grid wasn't really set up to manage that complexity. So in the old days, the utility said it didn't matter because there was so little solar PV on the system, they didn't have to see it, quote unquote. Now, especially in California and other places in the world like Germany, there's so much solar that you need to do something different. And so the microgrid is one way of aggregating not just solar, but wind and whatever resources are in like an area like Point Reyes Station. I tried to create a microgrid in Point Reyes Station over 5 years ago. We came very close to doing it. We almost got a $2 million grant, but it was 7 minutes too late. That was one issue, and then later we found out PG&E wasn't all that enamored with the idea. And that's, the issue with some of these microgrids is that utilities historically have been resistant, although that is changing. And a lot of my research now, San Diego Gas and Electric has built, they have a 30-megawatt microgrid, of which two-thirds of it is solar power online today. They're just adding a lot more solar to it. And now even some utilities are seeing, especially more on the East Coast where they were hit by Hurricane Sandy, see that customers want more reliability. Unfortunately, a lot of those start with diesel generators, which are one of the dirtiest sources. So with a microgrid, the goal is you add as much renewable as possible so you use your diesel as little as possible.
Mm-hmm. Peter, this is Lyons. You first and then Bernie said the distributed, and you said distributed energy. I'm not quite clear. Is that part of the new microgrid idea?
Yes, I mean it's the wave of the future, what people call distributed energy resources, which essentially mean, as opposed to even a large wind farm, which some people would say is somewhat distributed because you have individual turbines comprising the wind farm, but it is operated like a big plant. So distributed means solar rooftop PV is the
lots of elements.
Local.
Small little stuff.
Thank you.
That and can go back and forth. So it's not just like you're consuming power; you send power back to the grid.
Right.
And so that's the.
Thank you. Sure. Kindergarten here, and I love the fact that the word diversity comes up here. We see that we know that's true for the environment and the plant and animal world. It's great to hear it. That same concept coming up in the energy world.
Well, Peter, we're really lucky to have you in our community, and thanks so much for calling in and helping this discussion.
No problem.
Back to another point that said, I looked at this report published in 2012 in Nature by this guy called Richard York that showed that the growing renewable sector is not displacing fossil fuel energies at all, but we're actually leading to higher and higher levels of energy consumption across the board. His report showed that creating more energy sources from new energy technologies actually makes our energy demands even greater. It's the leaky bucket. Not only does demand generate supply, but supply generates demand.
We're never satisfied. We always want more.
Or if I think, okay, if I drive my electric car or my excellent German diesel car engine, it's okay for me to keep doing as much as I was doing because this is a better source of energy. So I'm still not thinking about cutting back my consumption.
That just takes us right down the rabbit hole there, doesn't it, of more and more societal and ecological collapse.
Well, because our ingenuity doesn't stop, and as long as we know there is electricity available, we keep dreaming up new technology that uses that electricity to make our life easier in one way or another. It doesn't necessarily make it easier, but that illusion that we can buy these gadgets that we need. That drives then more demand. And so given that the global demand, as you're saying, keeps growing, how can we turn that around? That's a tough question. And the politics, I'm afraid, aren't being honest. I think one of the reasons that there's so much climate denial and then there's so much faith in renewables is they have a hard time facing the physics of all this, in that it's easier to pretend that we can continue a growing economy, and that will indeed make everybody's life better in a political sense than this notion of, hey, everybody, we're just really going to have to power down. We're really going to have to cut out all of these appliances, and maybe even if the grid weren't on 24/7. Could you imagine if it came on for only 2 hours a day? You weren't sure when that was. This was the case in Cuba after the Soviet Union left, and stop shipping fossil fuels to the Cuban people. They managed to survive, and they were forced into a situation where, well, when that power comes on, we better be ready to run the washing machine if that's where our priority is, or get on the internet, or run this mixer or whatever. So we are spoiled. We can have it all anytime. We just plug it in. And it's really hard to unplug it on our own. When we're forced to, then we get more creative in how to cut back. But it's a hard thing for each of us individually to choose.
I've chosen it many times. I mean, I've lived in eco-villages and intentional communities in Southeast Asia and India, as well as the off-grid house in New Mexico. Me and my son participate in what's known as primitive skills camps or ancestral lifeways camps, where we intentionally go and live like our Paleolithic ancestors lived. And I have to say that it is amazing. It is wonderful. It is rewarding. It is rich. I don't think, I'd happily trade my life now to go back to pre-electricity times, because I don't feel like all these gadgets and transportation, and apart from radio, which I love, but other than that, most of the technological gadgetry has actually made me more unhappy and more unhealthy, and I feel like it's breaking down our communities. When I was pregnant with Zach 7 years ago, we were in Mill Valley. I didn't really know anybody, and the power went out for 10 days in Mill Valley. Maybe you remember that storm 7 years ago. Mm-hmm. And it was amazing. Everybody came out of their houses and met in the streets, and we had street parties, and people shared their food, and it was instant community when the electricity got switched off.
Yeah, it's sort of like a natural disaster brings people together. When we know we have to count on each other rather than sort of living alone like we typically do.
Yes.
I'm going to forget the author's name. Her first name, I believe, is Barbara, and the title of the book is Conscious Evolution. I've not read it. I keep hearing it, and I mentioned it to all kinds of people. It seems to me that changing our attitude is really what has to happen. And those of us who are well entrenched in our thinking, it's harder to make those changes. What do we think about next generations? Are we teaching our younger people, our children in school, to have different attitudes?
Well, it's not helping if what we teach them in schools is how to use your iPhone or your tablet rather than learning cursive writing and how to express yourself with a pen and a paper.
Well, I know a young man named Evan Forrest, who's the grandson of the Dirks in Bolinas. Sandy and Dennis Dirks have Paradise Valley Farm. And Evan has done 2 radio shows now where he's interviewed other people who work on that farm. And he's interested in talking with other people his age, young people his age, about organic farming, because that's the topic, that's the focus in his family's life. And I feel quite heartened hearing Evan get really excited about that and sharing his knowledge, his experience with others of his generation.
That's a great story.
I'm going to introduce another idea here, is that we hear a lot about de-investment in the fossil industry, and people also say, let's stop giving subsidies to the fossil fuel industry. I mean, that is really something that people are very anxious about. I've read where since 1950, nuclear power, has been receiving subsidies to the degree of $3.60 per megawatt hour. That's more than coal. Coal's been getting about $1.50 per megawatt hour of electricity. Gas has been getting more at $5.70 per megawatt. And hydroelectric, which some people want to call clean, but we know how much damage it does to the ecosystem where that watershed is totally transformed, that's been getting about $6, the highest of all of those in terms of megawatt hours of electricity that it produces. But if you look at solar and wind, who people want our government to subsidize more, it's estimated that it's already being subsidized at $100. So many, many more fold.
But of course, solar and wind aren't producing as many megawatt hours of electricity as those others, right?
Right, but if you're trying to trade out and what is fair, so renewables actually now are more dependent on subsidies than fossils and nuclear. That's something most people do not appreciate. And many people are indeed motivated to get a solar system, to install a wind turbine because of these subsidies. When the government is picking up the cost through these tax credits, that's a subsidy, and that has motivated many people to do it. But that has grown in industry, and we're well aware of the power of the fossil fuel industry. It may be one of the most powerful, but there's also a alternative energy industry, a green energy industry now that is becoming quite powerful, and they too are giving both our politicians and the public relations that underestimates or overestimates the benefit of what they produce.
Well, those subsidies also keep us unaware of the true cost of these forms of energy.
Yes, it's easy to only see a subset of this thing. Like I say, it's I'm buying gas or I'm plugging it into the electricity on the car, when most of the energy that's used to run a car is in the making of the car, regardless of if it's a gas-powered car or an electric car. Then that running of it indeed is cheaper on electricity than it is on gas right now, and it's probably cleaner if it's got renewable energy, but it's not clean, it's just cleaner. There's a number of studies that keep showing up. Stanford did a big study, and then I see lots of things on the internet that talk about how Germany or Denmark are setting the pace, and then they're really promoting how these renewables are possible at a large scale. In the Stanford study, they talked about the fuel costs being zero, when you're dealing with these alternative energies, and went forward on that. Well, some people, critics of that, have looked at it and said, well, sure, what really costs is the access, the extraction, the processing, the distribution, the installation, then the fuel is free. You could make that same argument about coal, oil, natural gas, and even uranium. They are essentially free there for the taking. And so those companies that extract them, it's not the cost of obtaining that fuel, but of extracting it, accessing it, manufacturing it, et cetera. So unless you really look at the full life cycle of any of these alternatives, it's too easy to fall into the trap of believing on the one hand you got free and clean, and on the other hand you got dirty, and all the costs are borne by future generations. I'm certainly no fan of fossil fuels. I have been believing that we need to keep them in the ground. But that ultimately means we have to radically change our lifestyles, not have the illusion that somehow through some technology we find an alternative to that energy. Technology is not energy. Technology requires energy. Technology may make us use it more efficiently, but technology cannot solve the fundamentals of physics. The laws of thermodynamics apply. There's no free lunch, and we all need to get over this idea of thinking that we can have ethical electricity. So I know that's kind of harsh, but I'm fortunate to be able to say this here on KWMR. And we've come to the end of our show. So I wish to thank the listeners and our callers today for your participation. And I hope you'll tune in every Thursday at 11, because your voice really does matter.